Welcome to our 25th My Story. This week our speaker is Bill Benjamin. Bill is American born and is currently the head of real estate investment for Ares Management, a large global asset management firm. Bill came to the UK in 2001, and as well as achieving a very successful career in finance, as I just mentioned, over the last 20 years, he's been actively involved in some of the largest organizations in British Jewry. Bill served as chairman of UJIA for 4 years and was a trustee of the Jewish Leadership Council. A Connecticut Yankee in King Arthur's Court is the title that Bill chose for this talk. You may know that this was a classic satire written by American Mark Twain in 1898, and also a 1949 film starring Bing Crosby. So, Bill, are you the knight in shining armor like Sir Lancelot, or the American crooner like the lovable Bing Crosby, or maybe both? Bill, over to you.
Thank you, Lawrence, and good morning, everybody, and thank you for dialing in. I see a lot of familiar faces from Shul, and it's nice to be able to put the names to the faces, and I hope everybody's keeping well in these continually challenging times. I'm going to talk about my professional experience and my communal activities, as well as some of the personal milestones in my life, with the hope that there'll be some nuggets of interest and it can be a springboard for a conversation towards the end. I thought when preparing for this that the best thing to do to help would just explain what I do. And my father, God bless him, still doesn't understand what I do. So I really have to work at demystifying it. Management, which has got activities in North America, Europe, and Asia. And Ares is called an alternative asset manager. That's in distinction to what a traditional asset manager is. So a traditional asset manager is an investment firm that focuses on the traditional assets. So those are the liquid assets like stocks and bonds, which you can buy through your broker and are traded on public exchanges. Alternative asset managers, names like Blackstone, focus on more the private markets. So private debt, which are loans to mid-sized companies, but not bonds, sort of replacing the banking system, private equity. And then what I do is real estate. So what my group specifically does is we raise funds that typically have a 10-year life, and we buy and we sometimes build commercial property assets in US and in Europe. Large apartment, the tenants pay us rent. That's a very big business in the US and continental Europe. It is a growing business in the UK. It's still in its infancy. We'll buy warehouses and logistics and sheds to benefit from the rise of e-commerce, and we'll buy offices, and to a much lesser extent, retail and hospitality, which we discuss later. We sometimes build, but we more often will buy single assets, portfolios, even companies. And what we want to do is we want to buy them, we want to fix them, and we want to sell them. We are not long-term owners, but neither are we flippers. Our investors are pension funds, insurance companies, private banks, and sovereign wealth funds. So when I'm not in lockdown, I can be found in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, which is the state capital of Pennsylvania, where one of our clients is the Pennsylvania State Teachers System. In New York, in America, there's a very, very deep pension fund system, both for public sector and private sector. I can be in Denmark talking to a pension fund representing Danish lawyers. And I often have to go to the Mideast, and I'm eagerly looking forward to taking El Al from Abu Dhabi for a weekend in Tel Aviv. May that happen soon. So that, in essence, is what we do. And we've got offices in London, Paris, Frankfurt, New York, Atlanta, and Los Angeles. And I oversee a team of 120 people. And I'll talk about my investment experiences, my management style, and the mistakes that I've made and the lessons learned. As for my early years, I grew up in Stamford, Connecticut, which is a suburb of New York City. My father is a retired GP, and my late mother had an interesting career both in education and in the private sector. And it was a loving home. It was not an observant home. Care. My wife just needs to mute, which is something you have to say quite gingerly. It was a loving home. It was not an observant home. We had Friday night dinner. We had the Chagim. We absolutely knew we were Jewish, but it was not observant. But my parents, leave it open? Yeah, you weren't on mute, so we could hear you. It's okay now, sweetie. My parents made I think, a momentous decision, which has had an impact on my life and my two brothers' lives, is that they sent us to the local Jewish day school from age 5 to age 13, and then we would go to secondary school. And what was important about that in my Jewish journey is it gave me two things. It gave me aptitude. It gave me Jewish literacy so that I knew I could read the Chumash, I could read Rashi's script, I had an introduction to the Talmud, and I could daven, and I knew Jewish history. And it also gave me attitude. It was for the most part a positive experience, where being Jewish was fun and enjoyable. It was affiliated with a wonderful modern Orthodox synagogue. And that was really where I got to participate around the age of my bar mitzvah and in my early teens in really warm Jewish with exposure to families who kept. It was a big impact on me. Another huge impact on my life was my maternal grandmother, Rose Dorfman. She was widowed early, and I like to say that she remarried Hadassah. Now, in America in the 50s and 60s and 70s, Hadassah was an umbrella women's organization that at one time boasted 300,000 members, if you can imagine that raised money for first Mount Scopus Hospital and then Ein Kerem. And my grandmother rose through the local chapter to the regional chapter to become national vice president. And she literally, in her 60s, 70s, traveled around the world and America, raising money among the Jewish communities for Hadassah. And it was her love. And she, being widowed, spent probably every third or fourth weekend with us and would talk about her experiences going to Morocco, meeting Mrs. Sadat in Egypt, going to Tehran before the fall of the Shah. And it was very, very colorful. And she was a hard Zionist. And she had been to Israel 40 times in her life, and including a long sabbatical where she lived there for 6 months. And I said once at a UJIA dinner that she was a one-woman continuity commission. And for each of her grandchildren's bar or bat mitzvah, she gave a check to be used when they were a little older for an Israel summer. So when I was 15, I went with the American Zionist Youth Foundation, which was the equivalent of FZY, to Israel. And American school summers are very long. So I went for 6 weeks, 2 weeks on Tiul, on tour, and 4 weeks I lived on a Yemenite moshav, about 45 minutes outside of Jerusalem, called Givat Yarim. And we would get up at the crack of dawn and we would work in the peach fields at the adjacent kibbutz Sova. And I lived with a woman whose name was Tamar Chaim. And she had come over on Operation Magic Carpet in 1948 when the Jews of Yemen were expelled. She was illiterate. She had 9 children. And she was widowed, and she kept a roof above her head by selling eggs. And I would help her in the chicken coops.
Oh, good on Michelle.
Which is, if it's 45 degrees and you're in a corrugated shed with chickens, it's quite an experience. And what was so amazing is I was an Ashkenazi boy from suburban New York with a Yemenite woman who spoke a guttural Hebrew, but we were connected. And when we made Friday night dinner, she would give me the siddur and she'd go, Zev, that's my Hebrew name, Zev, Kiddush. And I would say the Kiddush. And I felt that connection with the Am, with the totality of the people of Israel very strongly. And it stayed with me. I should say, as an aside, she knew how to have a good time too. The Yemenite Jews used to chew this plant called khat, Q-U-A-T, which is a hallucinogenic. And at night, she would forget the troubles of her life, sit on her bed, chew the khat, smoke her shisha, and watch Starsky and Hutch dubbed in Hebrew. And she was absolutely stoned off of her gourd. So that's very memorable too. In terms of my early career, when I went to university, in America, we do not specialize in one subject. I had a liberal arts education. I read the equivalent of politics, philosophy, and economics, and I really didn't know what I wanted to do. I didn't think I wanted to be a lawyer. I didn't have the Sitzfleisch to be an academic, and through a few summer jobs, I got involved with the real estate business, which culminated in a job when I graduated with Bankers Trust, which was a large New York clearing bank in 1986. And that's where I first learned my craft. State finance, lending on commercial assets on the East Coast of the United States. Bankers Trust doesn't exist anymore. It ultimately merged with Deutsche Bank. And in 1990, there was a tremendous banking and property crash called the savings and loan crisis, where many banks across the United States failed because of lending to the real estate industry. So we shifted from making loans to working out troubled loans on our own portfolio, but increasingly advising government and other institutions which had taken over these distressed. And it was at this time that a whole new industry came up called the Real Estate Opportunity Fund. So private equity firms like Blackstone and Apollo, and new firms like Starwood, all of which are multi-billion-dollar firms, got their start buying portfolios of distressed mortgage loans or foreclosed real estate from the federal government or from wounded banking institutions. So in 1995, I got approached by Apollo, which the real estate group was only 2 years old, to join them. And it was a base. And I said, you know, if I join Apollo on a Monday and I get fired on a Tuesday, I'm worth more in the job market on a. So that was probably the first big calculated risk I took. So after 9 years at Bankers Trust, I joined Apollo Real Estate Advisors in New York City. I had gotten married to my then wife in 1991. Our daughter Isabel arrived in 1997, and our son Jimmy in 1998. And we lived on the Upper West Side of which was my second exposure to really rich, wonderful Jewish living. We were members of something called, which was part of a larger synagogue called Anshe Chesed. And I need to say that in the United States at that time, and probably until very recently, the largest denomination, what you call Masorti in the United Kingdom. So this was a conservative synagogue, but it was the best of the movement. We had many professors from the nearby Jewish Theological Seminary, Jewish communal professionals, and there was a high level of Jewish literacy and activity. We had no official rabbi, so the praying, the reading from the Torah, and the weekly sermons, and all of the community ran by volunteer rota. But not only was there tremendous Jewish literacy and intelligence, it was a very, very warm community, and everybody looked after everyone else through good times and bad. And I still have many, many close friends from it. Back to business. So I joined in the summer of 1995, and about a month later, an American living in London who had been a banker at Goldman Sachs had set up his own little boutique real estate firm called Pelham Partners. And he pitched up at our office in New York, and he had secured an exclusivity to buy a portfolio in Norwich Union. And our chief investment officer looked to me and said, "Hey, give it to the new guy." And I was the new guy. So I flew over to London, and I was very jet lagged, and I got on a coach and I started to tour with the fellows from Pelham Partners properties in Ruislip and Gravesend and Bournemouth. And I did due diligence, although I knew nothing about what I was doing. And we did the deal to be a success. And that led through this group, Pelham Partners, to more deals in the UK and eventually spreading out onto continental Europe. So basically, Pelham Partners became the European boutique advisory firm for my firm, Apollo. And I oversaw that activity. So from 1995 till 2000, I was based in New York, investing in all sorts of commercial assets, but overseeing the growth of Pelham, which became 20% of our activity. In 2000, the principals at Pelham got very greedy, and they wanted to renegotiate their contractual arrangements with us, which were quite favorable to them. And the negotiations became very, very poisoned and bitter and unpleasant, and the relationship fell apart. And I went into my chairman's office and I said, "We have a great business in Europe. We've got terrific joint venture partners, which Pelham has introduced us. We should really grow this business." And I said, "I will go over for 2 years. My kids were not even in nursery school, and I felt I had a window until they were in full-time schooling. I'll set up an office and I'll come back." And I made sure that I had a contractual protection that when I came back, even if the business had moved on, they had to employ me for another year, because if things didn't work out, I wanted to be able to find other opportunities. So we moved over, we landed in April 2001. And I remember it was a cold, wet spring, and my 2-year-old son was jet lagged, and the only things on the terrestrial TV were snooker, snooker, and more snooker. And I said, "What have we done?" We lived in Holland Park, and things really took off. We were able to raise a dedicated European real estate fund. I started to build a team. I was traveling throughout Europe for business and vacation and beginning to really enjoy life. And of course, I met Gary Phillips at the Saatchi Synagogue, and that's a whole nother story. And when the end of the 2 years came, I extended my contract another year. And when the end of the 3rd year came, I extended for another year. And then I extended for 4 years, because each time home, I would literally get a lump in my throat and saying, "How can I give this up? We are having too much fun." The family was thriving and the business was really growing. And I feel blessed. I had the opportunity to build something almost from scratch, which is great in life. And then finally, after 5 years here, I said, we moved to St. John's Wood temporarily, and the house we were living in was put up for sale, and I had to make a decision because we weren't going to move again and again. So in an uncharacteristic moment of spontaneity, I said, "Let's roll the dice. I think we can make it work here." And we sold our apartment in New York City and bought on Frognall Lane in Hampstead. While we were living in South Hampstead, my kids were by that time enrolled in Naima JPS. The son arrived in 2004, so there are now 3 of us. And I knew a lot of JPS families from there. But my then wife had wanted something that was egalitarian. She wanted the kids to have their simchas in an egalitarian synagogue. So we joined New North London, which was the most offer to what we had been used to in the US. So I don't do things in half measures. I was a regular shul goer, and I got to know the very wonderful Rabbi Jonathan Wittenberg, who asked me to see if I could help out with the Assembly of Masorti Synagogues, which was the umbrella organization for those congregations in the United Kingdom. So I agreed. That was my first real foray into the Jewish communal word here. And we did a mini turnaround. We hired a very dynamic executive director who had grown up in the movement but was living in Israel. We came up with a business plan to make the membership better the value of the umbrella of the United Synagogue and what they go through. And we tried to turbocharge the fundraising, which was never easier. And I said, if we want to be taken seriously in Anglo Jewry, which was an aim, we need to get on the Jewish Leadership Council. So we paid the dues, and I joined the Jewish Leadership Council on behalf of the Assembly of Masorti Synagogues. It was at time chaired by Mick Davis, who I actually knew because his son Eitan and me were at school together. Gerald Ronson was there, who I knew through real estate, Trevor Chin, and it was a very, very impressive group among others. So I was on the JLC, and when it came time for Mick to step down at UJIA, he approached me to take it over. Quite frankly, I don't think there were any other sides. I genuinely feel this was not a comment about me, but really the sanity of everyone else who turned down the position. I did what I spent time with the chief exec, Doug Crickler. I spoke to trustees. I read the minutes. I read the financial statements, and I said yes. And nothing could have prepared me for the enormity of the task. And I was really dragged outside of the building. But I am glad I did it. I was chairman of UJIA for 5 years. And what I'd like to say is it was a great organization. What it does to connect young people to Israel, either through the Zionist youth movements, who aren't what they were, but still play a vital role, or the type of building of the land that UJI has done in the Galil is really impressive. And I don't know if any of you have been up there, but Anglo Jewry has built primary schools, secondary schools, management colleges. Tel Chai College was a co-founder of the Bar Ilan School in Sfat, nursing schools, in addition to the programming dealing with disadvantaged communities. And I think it's a real badge of honor for the community that's not well publicized. I did that I feel I left the organization in as good a shape as I found it, and hopefully in some ways better. Back to business. In 2006, the group of us bought ourselves out of Apollo and created an independent firm doing the same business called AREA, which was a very unimaginative an acronym for Apollo Real Estate Advisors. And we traded in 2013, described at the end, and 13, and we became graded subsidiary. And the reason we did it was our founder in the real estate group was in his 70s, and we had succession. More involved with his family investments than he was with the business. And also what we felt was so important was what we call distribution, is access to the global investors. And to do that, you need people in Hong Kong, you need people in Dubai, you need people in London, you need people in Scandinavia, and that was too expensive for a firm like us. So if we were going to grow and create an opportunity for all the bright talent we had, we needed to hitch our wagon to a much faster vehicle, and it has worked out brilliantly. So that brings us to And, if what I've described so far seems like a fairly straight, linear up line in life, my life was good and I had much to be grateful for. And my profession had prospered and I had three wonderful kids. But there were some dark chapters. After 20 very good years of marriage, I had 4 unhappy years of marriage, and my wife and I divorced in 2015. I rejoined South Hampstead at about that time because I felt a closer kinship with the community and with the families from JPS and with the people I knew from UJIA and other things. I want to say that particularly grateful to Shlomo, who welcomed me instantly, and actually everybody who made me feel instantly welcome, and it was like coming home again. So I have a great debt of gratitude to South Hampstead Synagogue. Fortunately, in late 2016, I was introduced on a blind date to a wonderful woman who had come from Cape Town, named Carrie Fox, and she had been here for language pathologist working with children with learning disabilities. And one day was the trip to meet my dad in the States and the trip to Cape Town to meet Stephen and Annette. And we were married in March of 2018 by Shlomo. And if you'll just allow me to screen share, in February of this year, I know it's here, just bear with me, it's quite indulgent. Here we go. Screen share here, I'm not sure it's. One sec. Tech, you wanted to, yeah. Samuel Fox Benjamin, February 28th of this year. And he has been the most wonderful blessing in our life. And we love him to pieces. And I'm eager to bring him to shul when things again. So in terms of business, the business has grown. Oversee 3 groups. One is European real estate equity, which buys and builds. We have a similar business in the US, and we have a growing lending business in the US, where we're really serving the function of a banks by lending on property. I'm not the greatest, I am not God's gift to real estate investment. Richard Loftus I see is on, and Richard can walk through a building and interrogate it. I do not have that bricks and mortar skill. I think I know good property and I think I know bad property, but I came to it through finance. I did not come through it through leasing and building and from the boiler room. I just wanted to talk about some of the mistakes I've made in business. The mistakes I've made have always been when my enthusiasm has gotten ahead of me. And the biggest mistake ever was really investing in the emerging markets. So I don't know if people remember in the middle of the 2005 or 6 era, if you would read about the BRICS, which was Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. Apologies to my family and my in-laws. Were all the rage and people were looking to invest there. We dabbled our toes in Moscow and we got burned, and we dabbled in Ukraine and we got burned. And we set up a fund to invest in India, which was probably the single worst business experience I've ever had. And we built a very nice shopping center in Istanbul and were shaken down by the government for bribes, the likes of which would make your head spin. So I think that was where our excitement got ahead of our intelligence. And when people talk about emerging markets, they focus on the word market and not the word emerging. So those have been, expensive lessons learned. And I'll just wrap up with some observations about much have enjoyed the time, and I'm not leaving in Anglo Jewry. And my grandmother was active. My grandfather was a member of the Zionists of America. My mother was a member of the Active Federation. And I think Anglo Jewry has a lot of strength and a lot of warmth and a lot of things going for it. What I'm always conscious of in my mind is that it's really organized in the exact opposite of the US. So in England, we have centralization of religion through the office of the chief rabbi and the United Synagogue. Now, yes, there's the Reform, and yes, there's the Masorti, but by and large, the United Synagogue is still the largest game movement, is the reigning force. And that's not a values judgment, that's a statement of fact. But the community is quite fragmented, okay? There's no umbrella. The board of directors doesn't serve that function anymore. The DLC doesn't have the financial wherewithal. So fundraising and organization of Jewish communal life is quite fragmented. In the US, it's the opposite. There's no central rabbi. There's no United Synagogue. There are umbrella organizations, but they each do their own thing and they work together or not. Whereas fundraising through the federation system, which isn't what it used to be, is quite centralized. So money is raised and allocated through education, social care, Israel, and other cultural, according to strategic priorities. And I'm not saying one is better than the other. I'm just remarking that those have been my observations of the differences of the communities I've had so that's my story. Isabel's now 23. She graduated university with a degree in psychology. She works in the psychiatric department of a major hospital in Providence, Rhode Island, and will be heading off for a PhD program. Jimmy is graduating Duke this year with a degree in political science. Charlie is studying for his A-levels at UCS, and Sammy is 9 months and having a ball. And Kerry is very busy looking after all of us and spinning the plates. So I hope this has been of some interest, and I'm happy to answer any questions or drill deeper on any of the topics that I've touched upon.
Thank you, Bill. Thank you very, very much. Shame about the internet connection, but yes. You still kept us all there with great interest. You've really had an action-packed life, both in the communal sense and in the business sense. So I'm going to open it for question. I'm going to ask a first question, I suppose more on the economy. I mean, we're sitting in sort of second lockdown, and you pick up the papers and you read about the decimation of world economy. And yet this week I heard of someone saying that we're about actually to go into the roaring 20s, that the next few years could be very positive, with perhaps people learning new, having new jobs, new professions. What's your view of this being in sort of the financial world that I wouldn't have a clue in?
Well, I think they'll be demob happy, right? After the lockdown is over, in the sense that people are those who can, and I emphasize those who can, will want to eat out. They'll want to take holidays. They'll want to enjoy. There will also be innovation. And I think working from home will encourage a lot of innovation. But I would, Lawrence, interject a cautionary note here. And I think that this is something that speaks to our. I fear that this will amplify the divide between the haves and the have-nots, because those who are technically savvy will benefit, but those who are not technically savvy will suffer. And I think that in the job market, the premium on education will be even higher. And the jobs in the low-paying industries, hospitality, food, retail, are really going to get hurt. So I'm not, I think there will be good things, but I think from an overall holistic standpoint, there will be areas for concern too. There's also going to be the mother of all fiscal debts. You know, the governments have been issuing unbelievable amounts of debt, and you can't kick the can down the road forever.
Gillian?
Hi, I just wanted to ask you, with everybody staying home and working from home, what's going to happen to the office blocks? Are you buying them?
Good. That's a great question. It's one we, Jillian, you must be sitting in on our investment committee because we debate this all the time. I think only the best office blocks now are either leasing or selling. So anything that is not prime has going to have a question mark. And this isn't on the one hand and on the other hand. On the one hand, there will be more space per employee, which would argue for greater demand because you need more office space to house the same number of employees. On the other hand, there will be more flexible working and more working from home. So that will lead to an erosion of demand. So I think it's very difficult to say. I think net offices suffer, but there are winners and losers. I do not think working from home is a blessing. You cannot build a corporate culture. You cannot build a team. You cannot train a young lawyer, and I cannot train a young investor by Zoom. You have to be in the room. You have to be in the office. And it's the energy and the synergy and the connectivity that makes a team function. It's a great second best, but it's a distant second best. But we'll have to wait and see on the offices.
Thank you.
Thank
you. Anyone else with a question? Can you put your hand up or unmute?
Hello. I've joined you rather late, so I've got a question which may not be relevant, Lawrence, but I'll ask Bill. Do you think that the H2 project, which costs billions and billions and billions to create railway lines and to link up to the north, are post-COVID, is it good for the government to be spending these large sums of money, since we are talking every day in billions of money, billions of pounds being spent, or is it something we should be economizing about in the post-COVID era?
I think that if you look at whether it was the construction of the national highway system by Eisenhower in the United States after World War II, or the construction of the Jubilee Line, a little bit late for the Reichmanns, but out to Canary Wharf, most infrastructure like this is always additive to the economy. It hastens connectivity, but it also creates important jobs. So I tend to be in favor of infrastructure. Okay. With that said, I don't know why the governments are appalling, or Western governments are appalling at delivering these things on time or on budget. I mean, if any of you have been to Boston, there used to be a canal separating the airport Boston, and there was a 10-year project called the Big Dig, which basically built a tunnel through and then paved over and created valuable acreage. But it too, like H2 and Crossrail, was a zillion years late and $1 trillion over budget. So it's a good thing, but it's been poorly deployed. But I would be in favor of infrastructure and leveling up.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Anyone raise their hand? No, Bill, I've got a question for you, perhaps end on a lighter note. So going back to the Connecticut Yankee in the court of King Arthur, perhaps Mark Twain's novel was the first novel about time travel, as the the subject moved back in time to King Arthur's era. If you had another option of time travel back into a Jewish environment, where would you go back to?
Ooh. Can I give you a variation on that?
Okay.
Can I answer the question you almost asked?
I thought you'd do this.
I feel fortunate not to have really any or many regrets in life. I think that decisions I made didn't always turn out the way I made them, but I think I made them thoughtfully and good faith. If I could do anything over again, I would have taken a gap year and I would have gone to Israel to study. I would have deferred university for a year and gone to Israel. Because when I look at my friends who've done it, I think it's been really transformative. It's don't worry, Annette and Stephen, I wouldn't have come back with Payas and a Strymel. But it wasn't an option growing up. This was 1982 when I left high school, secondary school. My parents were putting 3 boys through private colleges, universities, which wasn't cheap. They wouldn't have been able to have done it, and it wasn't on the radar. But I would wish I had done that, because I think it would have given me something that I've tried to catch up on, but it's harder to catch up on. But if I were to live in another Jewish era, probably pre-war Vienna. I don't know if you know. I don't know if any of you are familiar. You must be familiar with Clive James.
Yes.
Critic. What a national treasure, even though he was Australian.
That's true.
And he wrote about this wonderful collection called Cultural Amnesia, which is sketches of intellectual, artistic figures from the past 150 years. And so much of the outpouring of Western culture writing, he says, comes from Viennese cafe society, from overqualified Jews who couldn't get a job in the universities. So maybe to have been a fly on the wall before it really got ugly would have been interesting. But maybe people who lived through that, whose families lived through that, will tell me the reality was not as interesting.
Tom.
Thanks for a great talk, Ben. I want to ask you about your forecast for economic effects of the change of president in the United States.
Well, I'm not an economic forecaster, but he comes from a tradition of sound economic management. So, if you look at the 2 terms of the Clinton administration, 92 to 2000, the economy's fared very well. And Barack Obama inherited a recession, fixed the banking system and the automobile industry, and paved the way for the post-GFC recovery. So I think that this part of the Democratic Party has a good, the mainstream centrist part of the Democratic Party has a very good record. Janet Yellen is a very steady pair of hands. So I would be optimistic. I think that he's going to have to raise taxes. He's going to roll back some of the generous tax breaks that Trump gave to the corporates. But I would be a bull.
Charles, do you have a question?
Yes, Bill, thanks very much for that. Going back to your previous answer, you touched on Jewish education and your regret that you hadn't taken a year out in Israel. Putting together your experiences in the US and in England, how would you compare the Jewish education scene in both countries?
Very different. I don't know that if I can convey to you how lucky he is and what a debt of gratitude we all owe to Her Majesty that you can get a Jewish education for free here. In America, because of the constitutional separation of church and state, all religious schools are fee paying. So if you live in Manhattan, which is an expensive proposition to begin with, and you want to send your children to Ramaz, which is a good modern Orthodox synagogue, and you have 2 children, that is $50,000 at least after tax. Whereas in this country, you can send your children to some very good schools all the way through up until university, and you have to make a. And that's a tremendous boon to Anglo Jewry and an opportunity that shouldn't be missed. And as I see Sue Nyman is on the, they recently invited me to join the London School of Jewish Studies as a board member. And these are challenges about how to make the most of Jewish education here, which we're eager. In terms of curriculum, the other thing about the US, Charles, is that there's no national curriculum. So studies here, you have to navigate around the national curriculum. So you're quite pressed for time. So I think that it's difficult because my kids have only gone here, but I think that there is more economic challenge in the US, but probably more creativity in the classroom, would be my hunch from my peers and friends who go to school in the US. You know, there's a bit of a concern here that the Kodesh teachers that we have do not represent the lifestyle of the children that they are teaching, and that's a big disconnect. You could get a very well-meaning person from Stamford Hill or parts of Golders Green, but the children they're teaching come from different backgrounds. And I suspect in America, there's less of a disconnect. But I am speculating here. What I would say, though, about what I love about Anglo Jewry is there's a lowercase conservatism, which is, I think there's a very strong pattern of living, of Friday night dinner, of shul going, of family connectivity, and of demographic density, which is very sustaining. Whereas in the US, you know, outside of the big cities, it's spread kind of thin. And I'm not sure I'm able to articulate that, but there's how do I quite put it? You know, somebody uses the phrase and seekers. And I think that large parts of the UK of Anglo Jewry are dwellers, and that's quite sustainable.
Thank you, Bill. Well, I think you covered an enormous amount of ground there. A wonderful hour. Thank you so much.